All right, everyone settled in. Welcome back. And now for the headline act of our evening. We are going to be talking about something which I think we've never really addressed at a Wonderfest in the past, right? No, it's something which is entirely, well, not entirely, but largely subjective, and it allows us to tap into the experiences and the vision of the three people who are on our panel tonight, and it has to do with the future of science. One of the things that continually impresses me in the world of technology is unpredictability. Things happen that you would have thought experts in the field could have anticipated. That happens all the time, but they don't anticipate them. And a couple of examples of those are, of course, the human genome, for instance. You could draw a curve of predictions on how long it would take to map the human genome starting back in 1985. Every time someone thought that it would take, using current technology or even some anticipated technology, 50 years, 40 years, 30 years, something would come along and it was 20 years away and then 10 years away. And, of course, we accomplished it much faster than anybody anticipated. And that was both because of methods and technologies that came along. For instance, polymerase chain reaction. PCR machines now are commonplace in labs, but there was a time when no one would have dreamed of such a thing. And there are other examples of, in astronomy, for example, tools that we have that no one had anticipated that suddenly show up. And now, for instance, the Internet. Who would have anticipated that you could do a lot of astronomy without owning a telescope, doing remote astronomy using the Internet and telescopes in New Mexico? So what we're going to challenge our panelists with tonight is their forecast about the future of science. And that could be either what they think will be developed, discovered, described, or what tools they might be expecting or would like. And we're just leaving the subject open to them to address in whatever way they want. Now, you've just met these people just a moment ago, victorious from their walloping them kids, showing their breadth and depth of knowledge about all kinds of science. I'll briefly introduce them again so you know who the players are. Richard Zare, professor of chemistry at Stanford, first on your left. Second, Deborah Gordon, professor of biology from Stanford, and nearest me, professor of physics from UC Berkeley, Marvin Cohen. I'm going to begin by asking Marvin Cohen to make a presentation or a preface to whatever you are going to tell us tonight about the future, the promise of 21st century science.
Well, I'll stick to physics. I'm still recuperating from the activity that you just saw. My wife said, "How come you didn't press the button more?" And I told her I was acting as a consultant. I also said that I'm used to being presented with problems, thinking about them, going off, making little estimates, and then sort of developing and then giving it to a bright graduate student. So this was a big challenge. Also, I thought my last oral came with my PhD. I didn't think I would have any more orals. I thought I'd be on the other side of the fence. Well, physics is in great shape. And you're going to hear from a biologist, and you're going to hear from a chemist, and I feel that all of these sciences are in terrific shape, and you heard earlier about astronomy, and the public certainly has a great interest in astronomy, and so you know that a lot is happening there. Now, the American Physical Society has about 47,000 physicists nowadays. And when I was president a couple of years ago, it was the World Year of Physics, and I went around trying to get the general public and trying to get students interested in physics. And it seemed like the general population was interested in physics, but they only heard about a fraction of what was going on in physics. They heard a lot about the ideas connected with some of the new accelerators, and that's a wonderful area of physics. That's particle physics, where people are looking at very, very small things and trying to see whether or not they can build up a theory of what happens in terms of the fundamental particles. And so people hear about string theory and things of this kind. And there's huge projects going on. The one at CERN involving the so-called LHC, and they're going to look for new particles. So that's one area of physics, very, very active. Another area of physics is atomic physics. Atomic physics seems to die and then get born again, and it happens almost periodically. And some of the interesting things that are going on in atomic physics, and atomic physics is sometimes put together with molecular physics, study of molecules, and also optics. So it's AMO is another branch of physics. And what happened was that Einstein made a prediction with a man by the name of Bose that atoms could actually condense into a phase where they're all in the same state, and they act as all together in a very correlated state. This is called Bose-Einstein condensation, and that was found a few years ago. And that field has just been exploding with experiments dealing with atoms all correlated together at temperatures that are unimaginably low. And so atomic physics has had a rebirth. There's an area of physics called plasma physics, and that's when people are involved with, in a sense, particles that are in a gas and how they behave when they are in a gas or a plasma. And the thing that you probably have read in the popular press is about the use of this area to control fusion, and the idea that we could get all our energy from the fusion process. In other words, the same process that causes hydrogen bombs to explode. And there's a huge effort going on, and it's now decided that it's going to take place in the south of France. There was competition worldwide, and it almost went to Japan, but it ended up in the south of France. I think the wine and the rest had a big effect on the people deciding. And the hope is that fusion will be the energy source of the future. Now, many people joke that fusion will be the energy source of the future, and that will go on forever, that it's going to be the energy source of the future. But some of the people working in that field feel that there is a horizon, and they're going to get past this, some of the bottlenecks that have happened. And the time scale here, I'm afraid to say, is of the order of 25 to 50 years. But there's going to be a lot of effort, and people are trying very hard. So that's an area of physics that's very popular. And then finally, my own field of physics is solid-state physics or condensed matter physics. And we're sort of in the middle. We're in the middle in terms of energy. We're the particle physicists and the astrophysicists are sometimes talking about very, very large energies. And the atomic and molecular physicists are closer in terms of their energy scales to what Zare does in chemistry. And we're sort of in that range, but we're in the middle in the size and the rest. In our field, we're dealing with some of these areas that you probably have heard about, nanoscience. So we deal with very small objects like nanotubes. In my lecture this afternoon, I showed nanomotors that can actually sit on the back of a virus. We also work on another field I talked about this afternoon, superconductivity, where electricity can flow through wires with no resistance at all. You could take all the power of Niagara Falls and bring it all the way to Stanford, and with no losses if you had a room temperature superconductor. And people are working very hard in that area. There's also some fundamental aspects of physics that we're exploring in condensed matter physics and in some of these other areas. And I'd just like to mention one. In the way that a theoretical physicist like me views a solid, I can think of it as a collection of interacting atoms. I know that I put atoms in there. I know that they're sort of hooking up to one another. I know they're forming some kind of a solid, and I know if I push that solid, it'll move because it has rigidity. And so, in some sense, if I use my quantum mechanical models, I can start with atoms, have them interact, and tell you the properties of solids. But there's a remarkable other picture of what goes on. And it's closer in a sense to biology. And it's called emergence. If I deal with the other picture where the atoms make up a solid. It's called reductionism. In other words, I know the particles, I know the forces, and presumably in a very methodical Greek approach, I can get the properties of the whole solid. But in emergence, the idea is you've got a box, you probe it, and all you can know about that box is what comes back. Because it's what you see, what you hear, what you measure, and so forth. And so if you can describe what's in that box in terms of fictitious particles that you not really sure whether they exist, then you've described all the properties of the box. And it's hard to believe, but most of the time we're dealing with these fictitious particles. And I'll give you one example. There's a fictitious particle that the people around Silicon Valley deal with every day, the engineers, that doesn't really exist. And the particle is a hole. If you take a semiconductor, you know it's a box of electrons. You take one electron out, it leaves a hole. Now, an electron's a negative charged particle, and it leaves the hole, which is a positive charged particle. Now, if you tried to describe that box of electrons, and it has 10 with 23 zeros after it, electrons in a cubic centimeter, so it's just a zillion electrons in a box, you can't really describe what every one of those electrons are doing. But if you believe in the concept of a hole, you can actually think of the one hole moving through that whole system, the entire system, no pun intended, the entire system. The hole moves through positive. With a positive charge, you can explain all the properties of all those 10 to the 23rd minus 1 electrons in terms of this hole. So the hole's a fictitious particle. Another fictitious particle, I said one, but I'll mention two, is that atoms vibrate. And if you tried to go in and discuss the vibrations of all those atoms, it's a very hard problem. But we postulate a particle called a phonon that's like a photon for light. And we can describe all the properties of that solid in terms of these imaginary phonons. So then somebody says, well, maybe that's fictitious, or they're not real, they're fake. But it gets fuzzy about what you call fake, and Einstein worried about these problems since the year 1905, about the emergence. These phonons emerge, properties emerge, life emerges. You'll hear about this. There are emergent properties that come, even if you knew all the equations and all the rest of each individual particle, when you put them all together, things emerge. And to describe emergence is one of the things that we're working on. If I told you all the properties of a single copper atom, and I told you that a metal copper, all the atoms are exactly the same, if you only knew about one, you wouldn't think about the fact that the whole solid is rigid. You don't think about a rigid solid from one. So sometimes the sum is more than the parts. So in our field and in other areas of physics, our subfield of physics, there are the practical aspects. There's the connections between us and biology and chemistry. And there's the conceptual basis. How do we look at these things? Now, on emergence, Einstein argued with a man by the name of Bergson around 1905. Bergson didn't believe in relativity, and he was wrong. He just didn't understand it. But once he understood it, he admitted to Einstein he understood it now, and he said that Einstein was right. But they also argued and discussed the concept of emergence. And Bergson, who at 17 wrote a very important math paper, and then went on to do science, and then eventually got a Nobel Prize for literature, said a lot about how we perceive things. That there's some reality out there. This was a concept that Mach had, that Einstein thought about a great deal. And the question is, are we probing this reality? We're just finding out about this reality. Or do things, when they get together, when you get collections of things, do properties emerge? And so that's why Einstein had a lot of trouble with quantum mechanics, because most things in quantum mechanics you deal with probabilities and not with the real thing. So physics is healthy. There are applications. There are a lot of things that we do that influence your everyday life. Many of my colleagues take credit for inventing the internet. I was not involved. and Al Gore, of course, helped, and also the basic concepts of physics, the concepts of emergence. And even here on the Stanford campus, there are people who claim, don't get upset, this is not me, that the dimensions that we're living in emerged. In other words, time was not always here, space was not always here, left, right, up, down was not always here. These emerged. Now, those are very deep concepts, but we're going to struggle with them throughout the next century, and we're trying to get as many young people, hopefully young women, to come into our field and work with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin Cohen. And now for a biological perspective, we'll call on Deborah Gordon.
In the 21st century, we're going to need to learn a lot about ecology in order to figure out how to predict and keep up with and hold back as much as we can the effects of global change. And the questions that we're going to need to be asking about ecology are the kinds of questions that you're talking about, where we need to understand how a lot of complicated forces interact to produce results that you can't predict without really understanding how they interact. So emergence is a way that we in biology also have talked for a long time about an outcome that you can't fully predict from knowing the components or the input. But nothing happens by magic. So really questions about outcomes that seem to be emergent it's really a way of talking about things that we don't understand. Another example is the example that we started with about the human genome. So now we've sequenced the human genome, but that was one of the major achievements of the 20th century. But now in the 21st century, we realize that we don't exactly know what that means. And that's because we've understood through a century of learning about genetics that genes don't fully determine the organisms that they're part of. That is, you can have two individuals with exactly the same genotype, and they're different. And we know that that's partly because what genes do is affected by the environments that they're exposed to. We know that, in addition, there are further interactions that we would have to call random, molecular interactions, such that even if you had two individuals with exactly the same genotype in exactly the same environment, they would still be different. And that's because what genes do is to interact with each other, to interact with environments, to change the ways that organisms affect their environments, which in turn affect the way that genes work, so that the way that genes work is embedded in a whole system of interactions with a lot of complicated feedback. We could call all of that emergent, but I think that what will happen in the 21st century is that we will try to take apart those systems and try to understand the very complicated networks of interactions in order to try to predict outcomes. And I think that those same kinds of biological questions are going to be asked at every level. So you can talk about genes at one end and ecosystems and global change at another. And in between are all the biological systems that we think about and interact with all the time. So I study ants. I think about how in a colony without any central control, ants using very limited local information somehow in the aggregate produce the complicated behavior of colonies. You could call the behavior of the colony emergent relative to what we know about the ants. No ant understands what the whole colony needs to do. So we, trying to understand it, have to try to figure out how these very limited interactions between one ant and another add up to the behavior of the colony. You can think about a brain the same way. A brain is a mass of neurons that are interacting. The ends of neurons meet and fire, and there's a quick interaction. No neuron in your brain knows how to think about what time it is, or ants, or the 21st century, and yet your brain does that. somehow through these very complicated interactions with a lot of feedback among very simple parts. An embryo is another example that's fascinated biologists from the beginning. An embryo starts with a couple of cells. They have the same DNA. They divide, and somehow there's no cell in there saying, okay, you be muscle, you be bone, and yet somehow the whole embryo develops. So all throughout biology, from every scale, from genes through to brains, to ant colonies, to whole ecosystems, we have very complex systems, and I think that the biologists of the 21st century are finally going to give up on looking for simple answers and try instead to look for explanations for how systems like that fit together, how they change over time, how they respond to their environments, how they modify their environments, and how all of that feedback gives us the kind of predictable outcomes that we see.
I have to tell you that just before this event, there was a little discussion going on, or a gathering of participants in Wonderfest here, and Zare brought up, there was a conversation about the Antarctic, and he brought up penguins and a certain behavior of a colony of penguins, how they trade places and essentially protect the group from the cold by trading places between those inside the group and outside the group. And immediately Deborah seized on that and said she questioned how that behavior arose, or whether it was intentional or whether it was accidental. And you were thinking in terms of ant colonies, I presume, and every other colony of animal.
Well, I was just trying to think of something simple that a penguin could do that would have the outcome that you described.
That would explain that phenomenon.
Because I don't think the penguins get together and work it out who gets to be a penguin.
Well, I guess I didn't know, but at the time what I was listening to was actually a discussion about emergence, in a way. I mean, that's one manifestation of it there. So, Zare, you're next with the chemical perspective.
Thank you. Well, in trying to answer this question about the 21st century, I decided to go back and look at a philosopher by the name of Alfred North Whitehead. I guess with Bertrand Russell, he wrote the Mathematica Principia. I think that's right. Is that right, Keith? Yeah, okay. So now, Whitehead said the following, which I have to read it because I couldn't remember it. It says, "Religion is the vision of something which stands beyond, behind, and within the passing flux of immediate things, something which is real and yet waiting to be realized, something which is a remote possibility and yet the greatest of present facts, something that gives meaning to all that passes and yet eludes apprehension, something whose possession is the final good and yet is beyond all reach, something which is the ultimate ideal and the hopeless quest." Well, speaking of hopeless quests, this question is, of course, one in itself. But I didn't understand this totally, though I was in awe of it, right? And this person, I guess, Whitehead, considered himself to be a universalist Unitarian. I think that was what he called himself. And he said that religion had as its belief that there is at most one God. And after reading this, I think I understand how he got to that position. And I'd like to paraphrase that, but steal it another way. And what I want to tell you is my conviction that there is at most one science. Okay? One science. And this one science really is made up of all types of things that we do. And what I see increasingly is what's happening is that we will be using all types of things together. Let me start by trying to explain. Information and knowledge arrives integrated as a whole. It comes to universities where it is disintegrated into departments. Okay? And I think the whole goal of interdisciplinary work is to reintegrate this information, this knowledge, so that we can discover new things to the betterment of us all. And I think you hear about the health that's going on, and it's true. And what I see in terms of the future, and And it's hard, of course, well, what the great American philosopher Yogi Berra said, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. So it's true. So, of course, I don't know what's going to happen that way. But I do see the trend, and believe it's a good one, that you must be grounded will in some discipline. I'm not saying do away with departments. In fact, departments are very much the keepers of the truth for certain areas. And, I think that's a good thing. But the department that wins is a department that looks out at the world, doesn't look in at itself. And I see this happening all around. And one of the themes you've heard two speakers mention, and I want to echo it again, is emergence, or another way to say that, complexity. Okay? There are problems now which we really, when we look at them, we think that rules will emerge by studying the whole of that problem, which we won't get by looking at individual parts. I am interested in quarks, Strange and Top, okay, and others too. You can learn all you want about quarks, and unfortunately, from what I can determine, if you know a lot about quarks, well, I'm sorry, Tucker, you don't know much about atoms. And if you know a lot about atoms, you don't know much about molecules. You know a lot about molecules, you don't understand about phases of matter. And it goes on this way as we see at different levels. And now, what do we care about? What do we care about in terms of science? So I had fun. I asked a bunch of people to put down what they thought the most pressing questions of the world were. I was invited once to give a talk, but I had no preparation, so I started doing it this way. And they made a list on the blackboard, and I listened to them, and they said they were worried about their safety. Okay? How safe it would be. And they were worried about having a job or whether they could afford a house in the Bay Area. It's an economics issue. And we went through this for a while. They worried about other things, like how do they know when something's true? And I asked them when they finished this, now look, I said to this group who were high school science teachers that I've been asked to speak to, I said, think now, what of these issues does science help you answer? If the answer is it doesn't, you're wasting your time being a science teacher. I think it does, but I think a lot of the problems we now see are just so much more interconnected and require us to both go deep into something and then look outwards. And that's where I think the future lies. A very bright one.
Okay. This is very good. Very good stuff. I'm going to ask everybody to, if you have a question, be prepared to walk up to one of the two, not just yet, but there are two microphones about midway up both of these aisles, and if you'd like to ask any one of our panelists a question, you'll have an opportunity in just a moment. I'd like to, I never expected that emergence would emerge, I guess, but as a sort of a central theme here. One of the questions, and any one of you can take this, I have is, I think I sort of understand what you're talking about, that there are we learn different things when either inanimate objects, microscopic particles, or animals interact and form complex systems. How would you describe, this may sound like a weird question, when something emerges from this new complex behavior, what is that thing that emerges? Would you call it a phenomenon, a behavior? Emergence describes the emergence of what?
A new paradigm for describing the process, a new set of rules.
New set of rules?
Ways that we can predict something about what happens or have an understanding of it. Yeah.
Okay, and science is about finding out how things behave and determining what the rules for that behavior are. And with emergence, we get a whole new layer of rules. If somebody were to... well, I guess, let me get a little more practical here. I'm going to ask each of you the same question, one at a time, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And that is, you can answer this question in either two ways. This is a prediction question. One is, if in whatever your field is, you could have a dream tool, somebody would walk in and give you a piece of software or a device to conduct experiments, and that would make a lot easier what it is you're after, what you're doing. What would that thing be? Think of a PCR machine or something. If somebody could walk in and say, here, there's that magic thing for you to do your work, what would it could be a computer simulation. I don't know. What would that thing be? Or the question is, what horizon do you expect to be overcome within the lifetime of the people in this audience? What great leap do you fully anticipate? All the signs show you that, yep, before these people in the audience are gone, they will experience this thing. So you can answer that either way. Dick, you want to start with that?
Well, I don't know that it'll happen for sure, because again, it's the future. But if my dream is if I could understand how molecules come together and assemble into structures, particularly structures which are self-replicating. In other words, how do we get from non-life to life? That's, to me, a huge question, and one that I'm hoping I'll see a way. It doesn't answer necessarily how life got here, but it can answer how to make life in some sense.
But do you think that's within reach in the 21st century?
I think that may be within reach of the 21st century, okay. Yes.
Deborah, do you concur with that?
Well, there are two very different questions. One is, what would I like to have to do my work? And the other is a much bigger question about what sort of major steps. But I'm struck by how similar what I want is to what you want, which would be to understand how all of the moment-to-moment interactions within an ant colony, if I could track them all, how they add up to the predictable patterns we see in colonies. So I study how ants use the rate at which they touch antennae to decide what to do. And if I could, the actual technical device I would love to have would be something that would track all the ways that all the ants are interacting. And I think some kind of analogous technical device would allow you to track how all the atoms are interacting, and it's the same kind of thing.
It sounds as though you're asking for some sort of nanotechnology.
Something. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. And Marvin Cohen?
Well, as far as instruments, being a theorist, all I need is pencil, paper, and good graduate students.
A wastebasket.
But the experimentalists in my field, if there was the old story about the experimentalist who goes to heaven and God says, what would you like? And he'd say, I like a box with 2 dials. And this is for optics, intensity and frequency. In other words, if you could use light to bounce off things and investigate things, that's still an extremely important probe. And people are using lasers and synchrotrons and so forth. So in terms of practical things, in terms of tools, the idea is to try to get something where you can go all the way down from the infrared up to the ultraviolet continuously and at any intensity. And then the other instruments that the experimentalists use are these very fine tips, these scanning tunneling microscopes, and they go in and they can see the movement and the positions of individual atoms. So they can look at a surface, and if Zare can figure out how things can self-assemble, they'll see that they have self-assembled. Now, so these are very important.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah,
all right,
these are very
I'll put down
important tools.
Okay.
Now, from a theorist point of view, the kinds of problems that are raised here, if you ask me if I'm a reductionist or I'm an emergent person, my answer is just like this afternoon. And I said that if the student asks you if light is a particle or a wave, you say yes. So I would say yes, that we need both. We need to understand the kinds of projects that you were talking about in terms of if I know all the different parts, I can put them together in some reasonable way and understand what's going on. But then the extra thing about life or self-assembly or emergence, some of those problems, even with ants, I would attack the way we attack problems. I mentioned vibrations in a crystal. You know the nearest neighbor interactions. You know what this guy is saying to this guy and so forth and so on. And yet, there's some quality of the whole that is a behavioral thing that you can't tell from these just nearest neighbors. And the way, I'll get a little technical, the way we treat those problems is we turn them all into waves. And there are probably waves, I'm going way out on a limb here, there are waves in your ant colony of things that happen. And these waves actually can help you make predictions about what the aggregate as a whole does. So often the absence of ants, or I'm way out of my field.
That's the hole in your box of electrons.
Pardon?
That's the hole in your box
That's
of
the hole, right.
Yeah, well, we do experiments where you take out some ants. And see
You
what
take out
happens.
some ants,
Yeah.
and that's a probe, and that's a test particle. You take out the ants and you watch what the other ones do, and that tells you what the aggregate does. So there are common problems. And the idea of a self-assembly that Dick was talking about, that's a great problem, because if we can get things to self-assemble, we can take things like nanotubes and make computers of the size of a cube, of a sugar cube that you give to someone when they're born, and they just keep programming it their whole lives. There's enough information stored in 4 wine bottles of nanotubes that's equivalent to all the brains in the whole world, of all the humans. I'll leave out cats.
You mean the
and
capacity
dogs.
for pieces of data?
The capacity for pieces of data.
Wow.
So the idea is there's so much that you can put into these systems, these small systems, if you only knew how to access them and how to get them to self-assemble, and if you could understand how to predict the positions and how they'll act. And we've come a long way, but we've got a lot more to do, and I think that's going to happen.
Actually, speaking of predictions of behavior and self-assembly and everything, I got to ask you this question. This is principally for Deborah, but you other two guys are welcome to jump in here. The Craig Venter thing with transplanting a genome. Essentially, I'll just cut to the chase here with a lot of background, but this guy, who is a controversial figure, would you say, Craig Venter, in biology?
Is that the sheep?
No, the human genome, he probably beat the NIH to mapping the human genome, and now he has a new foundation called the Venter Foundation. And this summer, he took one organism, took out its genome, or took 2 organisms, took the genome out of one and planted it in the other, and he changed it into a different organism. Literally took a single-cell organism, mycoplasma, and he took there were several tricks involved with it. One is nobody had been able to do this before for a number of reasons. One, he claims that his institute was the first to take naked DNA, no proteins attached, just a naked piece of DNA. 2, he actually handled it and moved it without breaking it, which is another impediment to it. 3, there are several things, but I'll cut to the chase. The genome that he planted in the organism that he had taken the genome out of, it wasn't good enough just to have the DNA there. He had to trigger the DNA, start it. He had to push a start button for it to start operating. And it was actually tracked through several generations to demonstrate that he changed one organism into another organism by swapping the genomes. Now, my question is this. He claims that he is close to creating out of water and basic chemicals that aren't even proteins or polymers anymore, just basic chemicals, to create an artificial genome. Now, people have made strands of DNA, and they have made base pairs in any, like with a typewriter, you could type out base pairs, but they're limited in length. Now, here's what I'm getting at. He claims that by the end of next year, and probably, he says, within a few months, he will be able to create an artificial strand of DNA with exactly the AACCG that he wants, with 350,000 base pairs, totally artificial. Take that organism, take out the genome, and instead of putting another organism's genome in, put his absolutely, totally built from water artificial genome into it, and then push the on button and watch what happens. Now, I have no idea what would happen if he actually accomplished that. Do any of you have a clue as to... Now, obviously, the question is, that's a neat trick, but that you have to put it into a cell that's already self-assembled. So the DNA isn't enough, and it's the chicken or the egg question, which came first, the cell or the genome you put into it. But that's a pretty astonishing promise or a claim. Is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Do you think it's hocus pocus, or can you actually do that these days? Dick?
I have some comments on this. Science, what you do in science generally can be divided into 2 categories, potent and impotent. Okay? It's not impotent what you're talking about. It's potent. If it's potent, you can use it to do good things. You can use it to do things you wish you hadn't done. Okay? And I think this is going to happen. what you're describing, though what you've said are very large claims, and I haven't seen all that, but I think we're going to see this. It's going to be called gene therapy. We're going to be able to move genes around. People are trying to develop that type of medicine. And my guess is that this will be very important for overcoming certain diseases, genetic diseases particularly, triggering things when you're deficient in certain things and making up for things. Great. But we'll also now have the capability of making new sports figures, in which these new sports figures will look back what's happening today as, well, just child's play. So
steroids.
Don't need
it. Yeah.
So we're developing that power. That's true.
Now, the reason I brought this up was because emerging themes here are self-assembly. How do things work together? How do they know? How do they know how to behave? How do organisms like ants know how to behave? But how do molecules and atoms know how they're supposed to behave? We're reaching the point where you'll be able to build things in your laboratory particle by particle, I suppose. Will that happen in our lifetime? Or is that like 100 years away still?
Well, he still doesn't know how to make the thing grow without the cell he's putting it in.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that seems to me to be a huge
That's a
part
biggie.
of it.
Yeah, that's a biggie. Okay, I'll grant that's a biggie. Okay, so I'm going to open it up now to people from anybody in the audience who has a question. Walk up to one of those microphones, and we'll do. What is it? It's alternating left, right. You devise the technique here. Okay. Yeah, who's first? You? Go ahead, sir.
So we've seen some of the incredible things that science can do. I mean, the creature comforts, we talked about drugs earlier, and our general improving form of life. A few years ago, I'm sure many of you read this article by Bill Joy where he expressed basically a fear of knowledge and science. He talked about genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and robotics as all having the potential to essentially have a college student create, a pathogen or gray goo or a robot that would take out the humanity, take out the Earth. And, this kind of feeds into the dark side, the fear that a lot of people have of science. And I just thought I'd ask for an update, how people think about that. Is that, when I think it was Cohen, when he showed how plasmids, can just diffuse into a cell and then be reproduced with this thing that was, that's like the first step to what you're talking about. It just struck me that, wow, there really is a lot of potential there.
May I just, for those of you who weren't familiar with the Bill Joy article, just very briefly, he wrote it in Wired magazine initially. I think he published it there. And it was a doomsday scenario. The capabilities, we're approaching, according to his thesis, capabilities that we can't control. The FDA can't control them. If you ban it in this country, somebody will do it in China. And he was just predicting science out of control. This was, I believe, 10 years ago, 1998, I guess, something like that. There was a counter to it published by the same magazine from, I believe it was John Seely Brown at Xerox, some guy at Xerox. Anyone welcome to correct me here. And it was a controversy for a while, I should say. And so here we are 10 years later, and that doomsday hasn't arrived yet, or nothing really bad has happened. So I guess what you'd like is the assessment of our panelists on,
an update.
Is there a huge danger in getting better at what you're talking about?
For example, genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics.
I can say something for nanotechnology. I've talked to him. I don't think I ever read the article, but with any new advance, there are risks. For example, with nanotubes. The question is, can you breathe them? Can you eat them? What's going to happen? And so forth and so on. And there are risks. But often the risks are not the ones you think of at the beginning. And often these doomsday kinds of scenarios that you hear about are not very accurate. And some of the things that I heard were just not accurate for this area of science. You have to worry about some chemicals, of course, and there are many in industries that have so many regulations, and I think in the nano area you'll have the same thing. But the idea of this gray goo going all over the place, I thought was really not very plausible.
Well, so you're talking about dangers in the small, and he really was talking about dangers in the large. Maybe the genetic engineering is the one we ought to address.
Well, one of his theses was that you could build, using nanotechnology, you could build little out-of-control robots in vast numbers.
Right. That would consume energy and basically populate the whole Earth. But in the case of real biological systems, we're familiar with pathogens that can cause serious damage, and it's not difficult to imagine one that could infect the whole human race. And the question is, what is it that would stop that from happening as we learn more about these systems?
Well, I'll pass the pathogens over to my right and just say that it's okay.
Well, there are already a lot of dangerous things on the planet. We just heard tonight that there are 9 countries with nuclear weapons, and I heard something on the news the other day that by mistake the Air Force put 6 nuclear warheads in an airplane and flew them across the country. That's kind of dangerous. So I think that, yes, people will develop more and more dangerous things, but maybe we need to be thinking harder about how we organize ourselves and what puts people in a position to do really destructive things and what we can do about that.
Okay.
So it's a social. I think that's a social question rather than a question about technology.
Dick, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
I would add that the idea of weaponized pathogens really does exist, and not just the idea, but such things do exist, and the idea that we will stop it by the way we're proceeding with trying to stop nuclear weapons from proliferating is probably not sensible. It's too easy to do by too many. The real defense will come from understanding better living systems and the immune system and the rest, and how to counteract anything that happens. We're just dodged a bullet in the following way. Remember this thing called SARS? Fortunately, it stayed with birds. Okay, it didn't, by and large, didn't go from person to person. A person who touched the bird who had SARS got in trouble, right? But fortunately, it didn't go from person to person. Very lucky for that, or we would have had a major, major problem.
And I think, who was it? One of our presenters today talked about 28 Days, the movie, and that exact theme of something being out of control. I think, well, I hope we've answered or allayed your fears, but that's all we can say at this point. Yes, sir.
With the increasing technology and increasing rate of technology, how plausible is it that within the next 100 years, the effects of aging could be almost completely negated?
Believe it or not.
I don't know.
Oh, come on. What's the average age of an ant? I think this is going to become a surprise to somebody. There's a conference in Korea happening in about 3 months on technology, and there's a speaker who has organized a session on reversing the aging process. He's spending a lot of money in research on the aging process and is sort of becoming Mr. Aging. And he's talked to Cynthia Kenyon at UC and so on and so forth. His name is Larry Ellison, a pretty wealthy man. And he is exceedingly interested in the aging process. Probably because he's 50 years old now. I don't know. But I just found it curious that of all people, Larry Ellison of Oracle would be Mr. Aging.
Mr. Anti-Aging.
Mr. Anti-Aging, I'm sorry. Is it, Tucker? You had a question?
I do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
And actually, I might even have a partial answer. For some strange reason, the topic of aging has been a frequent subject of Wonderfest dialogues. For the past 3 or 4 years, we've had experts in aging give good talks, and each one of them has been much more pessimistic about reducing the aging rate, let's say, than the general population, of course, would wish. So, Daniel, it doesn't sound good. Even for you, it's certainly a bit grim for me.
So it's progressively pessimistic.
That's the way I read it.
Okay.
It's a very, very hard problem.
All right, thanks.
Sure, but I'm no expert. I just listen. I have a question about emergence. I'd like to understand it better. And I think a good example might be in water. That suppose we understand hydrogen rather well as the simplest atom. Knowing quantum mechanics, we can predict the behavior of hydrogen rather well. Oxygen, more complicated, but I guess quantum mechanically we can make sense of oxygen somewhat. Is it possible that from that knowledge of hydrogen and oxygen, we can predict beforehand, not knowing anything about water, H2O, could we predict some of the properties of water, say the density of liquid water and its change of density upon freezing?
Actually, we could. It's turned out in the case of water being simple enough that we can do pretty well with water. But where we would fail, interestingly, is if we started to put around the water something else, like a biomolecule. Then we would get very confused. We don't have the means yet of understanding, is the water next to something, like the walls of something, or metal ions, or a biomolecule, the same type of water as water in the bulk? A lot of evidence suggests it's not.
So it means you're suggesting that there could be, what would we call it?
I'm not saying a memory, I'm telling you about forces that really distort next to it.
It sounds like in a group or colony of creating this complexity we call emergence, there's a border behavior or an edge behavior where things, the transition area where things change. So water, after all these years, is still a mystery? Okay, that's good.
Sure.
That's good. Okay.
Ice is not, though. In terms of solid, from the solid, there are many people who work out the structures of ice. They don't get it exactly right. No. And in a sense, this is a time-dependent problem. Now, that's a problem that certainly will be solved over and over again over the next 100 years, in this century. People, and then a theoretical instrument I would like is a bigger computer, faster, more memory, and all the rest. We've come a long way in solving problems of how you create a system, a macroscopic system, by putting together hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen is tough, but you can put them together and form the molecule, and then put the molecules together in a way that you can do it. Now, Dick is right that once you start putting other stuff in, it gets really complicated. But I think you probably agree.
But in principle, it's still something we hope that you'll see happen in 100 years.
I think that will happen. I'm willing to say it'll happen. And if these anti-aging people work out, I'll be around to see it. So it should work.
All right. Go ahead. You had a follow-up?
Emergent phenomena are not in any way magic. They may be wonderful, but that, as you said, reductionism seems still to work because we can't understand what will come from, if not water, let's say, a more complicated molecule, a protein. To predict what those atoms will do when they get together is just beyond it. And so we call it emergent behavior, and we do the best we can to understand it.
It is probably in large a name for our ignorance, and after we know something more, we give it a different name. I think that's fair, isn't it?
Yeah, I think emergence is a way of talking about how we explain something. It's not about the world, it's about us. It's about how much we understand. And you can think about it as the tip of the iceberg, the part that's not covered by our explanation. But as our explanations change, then what seemed to be emergent becomes just part of what we understand.
Let's take an example of something which I think all of us will agree we don't understand how it works, the brain. Okay? We don't know how the human brain works. We know there's electrical parts to it. We know that there's chemical parts to it. But we know that alone, there is distributed information that interacts. All the dendrites, that are connected. We're looking for a new pattern to emerge. There's the emergent again. A new pattern which will allow us to understand better operations of the brain.
When I was a graduate student, my closest friend said that when theoretical physicists age, they start working on the brain, and that's because they start to lose it. And while they're losing it, since they think they can do everything, they're going to figure it out. I think that in terms of there are models of the brain that arise in terms of these collective kinds of behavior that we were talking about earlier that sound like emergence. Now, on the emergence thing, just to be clear, I think if you talk about angels on the head of a pin, then that's equivalent to the kinds of discussion that you would give, that a pure reductionist would give. In other words, if I had infinite knowledge of my system, I had infinite brilliance so that I could figure everything out, I have infinite computer power, and I have all these infinitely potent tools, then all you'd need is reductionism. But you never do. And so you don't attack the problem from the standpoint of being able to do the problem using pure reductionism, because in principle, and there's probably a theorem, that you can never have infinite all of those things. And so if you can't have infinite all of those things, then this concept of getting to a certain stage with your knowledge through reductionism, and then there's a property of the whole that you cannot predict on the basis of the limited amount that you have. And that's what Dick was saying before. It's something that happens then because of ignorance. But I don't want to make the ignorance sound like it's a defect. It's something that you could probably never achieve for certain kinds of problems. Then properties emerge. And sometimes the properties of a whole, like color. I mean, you know everything about these atoms, but the perception of color is an emergent property. And to think about that, you really have to know about all our sciences here. And then you would get to explain something like that. So you can be a pure reductionist, and I would agree. I'd be in that camp if you give me infinite power in all the areas. But once you have limited power, and we all do, then these concepts come in.
All right, one more question. Do you have a question in the young man, Hurley? The T-shirt says Hurley. Okay, go ahead.
I was listening to the media once, and some person claimed that they had made a diet that could reverse your age. Do you think by diet alone that you could actually reverse the aging process?
What I've seen has not cheered me up at all. It says that if you eat a lot less, you live longer.
Right.
Folks, it's bad news for me.
But ultimately, I mean, at first I had an immediate or almost a knee-jerk response to that, but then I'm thinking maybe somehow there's some mechanism that could one day do that.
The aging process isn't just one thing.
No.
The aging process is very complicated. Lots of different things going on and happen differently in different conditions. And people age differently, or all of the processes that are part of aging happen differently in different people depending on the conditions that they're in. And so it seems really unlikely that there would be one thing that would have the same effect on everybody for anything, aging or not. So
Okay.
I'm skeptical.
Thank you. You have another question? Go ahead.
Yeah, this might be pretty quick. It's for Dr. Cohen. It's about kind of philosophy of science. You touched on some of Einstein's early concerns, and one of the areas that really interested me, like from the Einstein-Rosen paradox, they did these dual particle experiments in the 80s. And my takeaway message from that is that no, what do they call it, locally realistic, deterministic theory. I mean, basically, you can't explain physics with hidden hidden parameters, with hidden variables that you can't see. And that, to me, seems like a very deep and troubling result. And I wonder if, why that isn't getting out there more, or how it's getting out there, or, I mean, are those experiments the final word on this? Are there any kind of philosophical concerns left in physics like that aren't fully understood and part of the common understanding of people?
Well, many of us are working on those things, and for a strange reason, we're working on it because of this concept of quantum computing. And what Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen did was they thought about the question of how you can take two particles, and these particles can be created at a specific time, and then you separate them by huge distances, and then by doing something to this one, the other one knows, and they're further apart than the speed of light could ever get. And this is one of the concepts that Einstein worried about, and he talked about the collapse of the wave function and what can happen. Well, there are people now who have actually shown that these particles are in communication even though they are kilometers apart. And there was an experiment this past summer. I haven't seen the publication yet, but I was told that the experiment was done from mainland Europe, wherever this was, because it was a big secret at the time, to an island. So one of the particles even got far enough away, and yet they could communicate because they were entangled, is the word, quantum mechanically. Now, there's the old dilemma of Schrodinger's cat. And actually, Einstein, in a sense, had a precursor to the cat, and he believed he was looking for ways that he could show that quantum mechanics was wrong. In Schrodinger's cat, if quantum mechanics was right, well, Schrodinger's cat was alive and dead at the same time. And I won't go into the whole experiment. But the point is that a cat can only be alive or dead. But the point is nothing gets determined until you measure it. And this is this collapse of the wave function. So to answer your question in a short way, nobody yet has found anything that contradicts these fundamental beliefs that we have about quantum mechanics. And no hidden variables have been found. And yes, we're all working on it. Yes, we're all amazed by it. And it's called, as Einstein used to say, it's spooky. And that was the term. And it's still spooky, and yet we can calculate these things with incredible precision and make predictions, and they work. But the actual mechanism of how they work is still not clear. And that's an active area of physics, and that's going to go on for some time. Now, whether that gets solved this century, I don't know. So, anyway, on that mysterious note, I guess.
I would, and that's perfect. It's almost Halloween, so spooky is perfect. I think, and we'll call it a night at that. How about a hand for our panelists, Richard Zare, Deborah Gordon, Marvin Cohen. Two final notes. Thank you all for coming, by the way, and remember to tell all your friends about the rare opportunity of Wonderfest for tomorrow, but also next year. Mark on your calendars, Wonderfest 2008. I would like also a hand for Tucker Hyatt, who is putting this wonderful event on. Works very hard every year. And tomorrow, I hope to see some of you on the Cal campus, and I hope to see all of you next year, each one bringing a friend or a family member, so we fill this theater. Thank you, everybody, and good night.